There are stories the pack refuses to tell in full, not because they are forgotten, but because remembering them feels like reopening something that never healed properly. This is one of those stories. It begins with a Luna on her knees, not defeated in battle, not captured, but abandoned by the only alpha she ever trusted. She did not scream. She did not fight. She begged him to stay. And when he finally turned his back on her, the entire forest went silent in a way no elder could explain. No wind, no sound, no movement, just stillness. And in that stillness, something inside her broke, not into weakness, but into something far more dangerous than anyone in the pack had ever prepared for. Because that night, the alpha left a woman behind, and unknowingly awakened something that would one day stand against everything he built. And when it finally returned, it did not come back as what it once was. It came back as his greatest fear. Some chapters begin in a territory already shaped by his rule. 7 fractured lands unified under one name, one command, one authority that did not ask for permission to exist. Kale did not rise through inheritance or alliance. He rose through consequence. Every pack that resisted him learned the same lesson. Structure replaces conflict, and anything that refuses structure is removed from it. By the time the Silver Ridge Accord stabilized, his presence alone was enough to silence debate before it became dissent. And yet, within that absolute order, there was one constant that never fully aligned. Vale is Luna. Not a symbol of weakness, not a decorative counterpart to soften his rule, but a council-selected stabilizer meant to balance what they called his intensity. She stood beside him in every formal declaration, every territorial gathering, every binding ritual that required unity to appear intact. On the surface, she fulfilled every expectation. Her voice was steady when it needed to be. Her presence was controlled when observed. Her compliance was unquestioned in public record. But those closest to the inner circle noticed something that was never spoken openly. Elora did not behave like someone who belonged entirely to the structure she served. She moved within it but never fully merged with it. There was always a distance in her silence, not emptiness, but attention directed elsewhere, as if part of her awareness was constantly listening to something the rest of the world could not access. Kale noticed it. He always did. But he never questioned it. Not because he was unaware, but because he believed structure corrects what does not immediately align. Everything within his rule eventually adjusted. Everything became coherent under time and pressure. That belief was not arrogance to him. It was experience. Until the moon binding ceremony. The ceremony was not ceremonial in the way outsiders understood it. It was enforcement disguised as tradition. A public reinforcement of the Alpha-Luna bond, designed to ensure that unity remained visible, undeniable, and absolute in the eyes of every ranked wolf present. That night, the entire territory gathered beneath a sky that felt unnaturally still, as if even the wind understood it was not allowed to interfere. Kale stood at the center of the circle without movement. Elora stood beside him, equally composed. But witnesses later described a detail that unsettled them in hindsight. Elora was not observing the crowd. She was observing Kale. Not with expectation, not with fear, but with the quiet stillness of someone watching an outcome already decided. Then the council stepped forward and introduced a second Luna. Cirrus, younger, carefully selected, politically approved long before the ceremony took place. Not presented as replacement, but as continuation, a term designed to soften contradiction without removing it. Kale did not react immediately. There was no visible disruption in his posture, no break in composure. He accepted the council's decision without resistance. And in doing so, he preserved the appearance of stability for the pack watching him. But Elora did not move for a moment. Not because she was frozen, but because something inside her had stopped negotiating. She exhaled once, slow and controlled, like a final internal calculation reaching completion. Then she stepped back. One measured pace. Then another. Each movement precise enough to be deliberate, but calm enough to avoid immediate attention. No one stopped her. Not because they agreed, but because no one understood what it meant for a Luna to walk away from an alpha without breaking the bond in violence. Kale did not call her name. Not immediately. His attention remained forward, anchored in ceremony, in structure, in the expectation that deviation would resolve itself as it always had before. That belief held for only a moment longer than it should have. Elora crossed the ceremonial boundary stone without hesitation. And the reaction that should have followed did not come. No alarm from the pack. No immediate correction from the council. No instinctive pursuit from the guards trained to maintain unity at all costs. Only silence. Not absence of action, but absence of clarity. As if the rules that govern separation between Alpha and Luna had not yet decided how to interpret what was happening. Elora continued into the eastern approach of the forest. And with every step she took beyond marked territory, something subtle began to shift in how the environment responded to her presence. Not violently, not dramatically, but incorrectly in ways that could not be immediately explained. Sound diminished first. Not all at once, but selectively. As if the forest was deciding which noises still deserved to exist. Then movement softened, like reality itself was adjusting its attention elsewhere. By the time she reached the outer tree line, she was no longer being followed in any meaningful sense. She was being observed, not by the pack, but by something older than their systems of control. That same night, 3 patrol hunters were dispatched to confirm her trajectory beyond the border. Only 2 returned. The survivors did not report an encounter in the traditional sense. They did not describe attack, ambush, or pursuit. Instead, they described confusion layered over instinctual disorientation. One of them said they were following a trace that stopped behaving like a trail and started behaving like awareness. As if whatever they were tracking already knew they were behind it, and adjusted accordingly without effort. He stopped speaking shortly after. The second survivor gave only one consistent statement before being removed from active duty. He said, "We weren't following her. We were being allowed to follow." Kale received the report without interruption. And for the first time since his rise to power, he did not issue an immediate directive. Not because he lacked authority, but because the situation did not yet conform to any category that authority could act upon. 3 days passed without official acknowledgement of Elora Vale's status. And in that silence, the pack began to change. Not openly, not immediately, but internally where structure is most fragile. And Kale Draven, who had once unified fractured territories through certainty alone, began to notice something unfamiliar forming at the edge of his control. A gap in predictability. A space where Elora's absence should have resolved into conclusion, but instead continued to behave like an unanswered question. And somewhere in the eastern forest beyond recorded borders, something that had once been defined as Luna stopped behaving like something that could be followed at all. 3 days after Elora Vale crossed the ceremonial boundary, Silver Ridge did not descend into chaos in the way outsiders might expect. There were no immediate uprisings, no visible fractures in command, no open challenge to Kale Draven's authority. Instead, what developed was quieter, more difficult to correct. Uncertainty. It did not arrive as panic. It arrived as hesitation in decisions that used to be automatic. Patrol formations that used to move without question began to pause before execution. Council messages that once returned in hours now required repeated confirmation before acknowledgement. Even the training grounds, once loud with disciplined aggression, carried moments of stillness that felt unnatural, as if every wolf was waiting for an instruction that was no longer being issued. And at the center of it all, Kale remained unchanged in appearance, but not in observation, because for the first time since his rise, the system around him was producing a result he could not immediately reduce into structure. Ellora's absence was not behaving like absence. It was behaving like influence, not active interference, not rebellion, something more subtle, something that did not announce itself through action, but through the absence of expected outcomes. The first confirmed incident occurred at the eastern border patrol line. A 12-wolf unit assigned to monitor movement beyond the tree line reported a disturbance at dusk. Their communication log remained intact, but fragmented. What could be reconstructed described a shift in environmental awareness before any visual contact was made. One patrol member noted that the forest felt aware of them noticing it, a statement that was dismissed at first as stress distortion. But the recording continued. They did not encounter Ellora directly. They encountered the concept of following her. And that distinction became important later. Because every attempt to track her did not fail in the traditional sense. It degraded in coherence. Directional certainty weakened first. Then memory of intent. Then continuity of purpose. By the time the unit reached what should have been a confirmed tracking zone, half of them could no longer state why they were there. Only 2 returned fully conscious. One refused to speak. The other provided a report that was later sealed from general circulation. He described it simply. We were following something that knew we were following it, before we made the decision to follow it. Kale reviewed the report once, then twice, not because he doubted its accuracy, but because it introduced a variable he had not accounted for in any known pack structure: awareness preceding action without visible cause. That evening, Saris attempted to initiate council alignment procedures. She entered Kale's chamber under formal protocol, expecting directive restoration. What she found instead was Kale standing near the territorial mapstone, unmoving, eyes fixed on the eastern boundary line. He did not turn when she entered. That alone was enough to signal that something had shifted. "Do we deploy retrieval units?" she asked. Pause followed. Not long enough to be hesitation in speech, but long enough to indicate internal processing that did not resolve cleanly. Kale answered without looking at her. "No." One word. Final in tone. Not because it was absolute, but because anything more would have required classification he did not yet have. Sarah stepped closer. "The pack is destabilizing. They are interpreting her absence as—" "Stop," Kale interrupted. Not raised voice. Not anger. Control. But sharpened. Because something in her statement was incorrect in a way that he was not yet ready to allow into language. He finally turned his head slightly toward the eastern map edge. And spoke again. "She hasn't destabilized anything." Then quieter. "She's displaced it." That was the first moment Sarah stopped speaking entirely. Because displacement implied movement without visible action. And in their understanding of pack structure, nothing moved without leaving evidence. Yet evidence was exactly what was missing. That same night, the second confirmed anomaly occurred deeper within the eastern perimeter. A 3-wolf recon unit reported visual confirmation of a lone figure near the tree line at approximately lunar descent. Distance estimation placed the subject at over 200 meters. No immediate engagement was ordered. The unit maintained observation protocol. But what they described did not remain stable across accounts. 2 members reported seeing Ellora Vale standing still between trees. 1 member reported seeing only movement in the air where she should have been. The 4th member reported no visual contact at all, but insisted that something had noticed them noticing. The report ended abruptly. Not due to termination, but because the unit stopped transmitting simultaneous data. When a retrieval team reached the site at dawn, there were no signs of physical conflict. No claw marks, no broken terrain, no scattered evidence of retreat or pursuit. Only one anomaly remained: a circular disturbance in the soil, as if something had stood there long enough for the ground itself to acknowledge weight that no longer behaved normally. At the center of it, a fragment of carved wood. Not identifiable by origin. Not traceable to any known pack insignia. And beneath it, a single mark pressed into the earth. Not written, not scratched, but impressed as if reality itself had been briefly compressed into recognition. Cale did not authorize public dissemination of the findings, but he requested the fragment be brought to him privately. When it arrived, every witness in the chamber reported the same inconsistency afterward. They could not agree on what the fragment looked like. Some described a carved symbol. Others described a smooth object with no pattern at all. One simply said it looked like a reminder of something they were not supposed to remember. Cale held it for less than a minute, then placed it down without comment. And for the first time since Ellora's departure, he left the chamber without issuing a single order. That night, patrol frequency across the eastern border increased without command authorization. Not by directive, but by instinct among lower ranks attempting to re-establish control over an environment that no longer responded predictably. And still, no confirmed sighting of Ellora Vale was recorded in the traditional sense. Only indirect evidence. Only environmental irregularity. Only the growing understanding that what had left the pack was no longer behaving like a missing individual. It was behaving like a condition spreading through certainty itself. And Cale Draven, who had once ruled 7 territories through absolute definition of structure, began to confront a problem that could not be solved through command. Because there was nothing left to command. Only something that was beginning to observe them back. Ellora Vale was no longer being tracked. Not in the way a fugitive is lost within terrain. Not in the way a rogue wolf disappears beyond borders. What was happening now was different. Every attempt to locate her produced results that failed to stabilize into certainty. Coordinates shifted after confirmation. Witness accounts contradicted themselves without external influence. And patrol logs began showing inconsistencies not in what was recorded, but in what could be agreed upon afterward. It was as if Ellora's absence was not a fixed point in space, but an active condition affecting perception itself. Cale Draven understood this before anyone else did. Not because the reports told him directly, but because the pattern no longer obeyed the rules of pursuit. And Cale had built his entire rule on the assumption that everything could be pursued. That night, he left the central hall without escort. No announcement, no formation, no ceremonial acknowledgement of departure. Saris attempted to follow protocol and request authorization to accompany him. He stopped her with a single look. Not hostility, not anger, finality. And for the first time since Ellora's departure, no one questioned his decision to move alone. The eastern forest did not resist his entry. That was the first irregularity. A controlled territory always reacts to alpha presence. Even neutral zones adjust in subtle ways. Sound reduction, animal movement, wind shift. But here, there was none of that. The forest behaved as if Cale was not an intrusion. Not a threat. Not even a variable worth adjusting for. It behaved as if he was simply arriving late to something already concluded. Cale advanced deeper without speaking. The further he moved, the more the environment lost structural familiarity. Landmarks that should have been consistent under pack mapping appeared slightly altered. Distances that should have taken measurable time to cross felt shortened without explanation, then extended again without warning. It was not disorientation. It was recalibration. As if the forest was adjusting its interpretation of him in real time. Then he stopped, not because he sensed danger, but because something responded. Not audibly, not physically, internally. A recognition that did not originate from instinct alone. A pressure behind perception, like being acknowledged by something that should not have awareness of his presence. Cale turned slightly. And for the first time since entering the forest, he spoke. Not a command. Not a demand. Name. Ellora. The word did not echo. It did not carry through the trees in the way spoken sound normally would. Instead, it seemed to be absorbed by the environment and returned in a different form. Not repetition. Reaction. The air tightened. Not aggressively, but attentively, like the forest itself had shifted focus. And then she appeared. Not as arrival. Not as movement from distance. But as continuity. As if she had always been standing there and only now permitted perception to align with her presence. Elora Vale stood between two fractured beams of light breaking through the canopy. Unarmed. Unchanged in form. But not unchanged in presence. There was something about her stillness that no longer matched memory. Not because she looked different, but because she no longer felt like someone occupying space in the same way as before. Kale did not move forward immediately. Neither did she. Seconds passed. And more. Time in the forest no longer behaved in a way that made urgency meaningful. Finally Kale spoke again. "What are you doing here?" Elora tilted her head slightly. Not confusion. Assessment. As if the question itself was incomplete. When she answered, her voice carried no emotional instability. Only clarity. "I stopped being here when you stopped seeing me." Kale's gaze tightened. "That's not an answer." Elora's eyes did not shift. "It is the only one that still matches the truth." Silence followed. Not empty silence. Occupied silence. The kind that feels like something is being measured without instruments. Kale took one step forward. The forest did not react. Elora did not retreat. But something subtle changed in the space between them. Not distance. Definition. Kale spoke again. "The pack is destabilizing because of your absence." For the first time, something resembling response moved through Elora's expression. Not emotion. Not satisfaction. Recognition of consequence. Then she answered. "No." Single word. But structured like correction. Kale narrowed his focus. "That's what the reports show." Elora's gaze shifted slightly toward him. Not to confront, but to clarify. "The reports show what they are able to interpret." Then she continued. "They are not interpreting me." Another silence. He stepped closer. This time the forest did react. Not loudly. Not violently. But perceptibly. Like an audience adjusting its attention. Kale stopped. And in that pause, something became clear to him that had not been clear before. Elora was not being followed. She was being contextualized by the environment itself. Not as prey. Not as threat. As reference point. Kale spoke again, quieter now. "What did you become?" Elora did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried no declaration of transformation. Only acknowledgement of process already completed. "I became what remained when I stopped waiting to be understood." A long silence followed. Not interruption. Continuation. Then Kale said something that did not belong to command structure. Something that sounded closer to uncertainty than authority. "I never stopped seeing you." Elora's gaze held steady. "That is not what I experienced." And for the first time in his rule, Kale did not correct the statement. Because something in it could not be dismissed without acknowledging contradiction within his own certainty. The forest shifted again. Subtle. But undeniable. As if it had reached a decision about the conversation and was preparing to respond accordingly. Elora turned slightly. Not away from Kale, but away from continuation. As if this encounter was not a reunion, but a boundary being observed. Kale noticed the movement immediately. "Where are you going?" Elora paused. Then answered without turning fully back. "Not away from you." Then the correction came. "Away from what you still think I am." And with that, she stepped back into the forest. Not disappearing. Not vanishing. Simply no longer aligning with visible certainty. And this time, the forest did not obscure her. It accompanied her. Not as pursuit, but as agreement. Kale remained where he stood, unmoving, as the eastern forest resumed its natural silence around him. But it was no longer the same silence he had entered with, because now it carried something else inside it. A recognition that what had once been part of his system was no longer operating within it. And somewhere deeper in the forest, Elora Vale continued forward into something that no longer required permission to exist. Elora Vale was no longer behaving like a missing Luna. She was behaving like an influence that persisted without proximity. And that distinction changed everything. Because in a structured pack, absence is supposed to create a vacuum. Something that can be filled. Something that can be corrected. But what was happening now was not a vacuum. It was expansion. Across the eastern border, patrol patterns began to fail in increasingly subtle ways. Not through attack or confrontation, but through inconsistency in outcomes. Routes that should have produced predictable results no longer aligned with previous mapping. Units assigned to identical patrol lines on consecutive nights returned with conflicting environmental descriptions. Some reported dense silence where others reported audible movement. Some reported clarity of terrain where others insisted the same terrain had become unrecognizable. At first, these discrepancies were classified as fatigue variance, then sensory interference, then psychological instability. But none of those classifications held under repeated review, because the contradiction was not in perception alone. It was in agreement. Wolves who experienced the same location could no longer confirm the same reality afterward. And that was when Cale Draven ordered full restriction of eastern incursions. Not as retreat, but as containment. For the first time since his rise, Cale was not extending control outward. He was drawing it inward. And that alone was enough to unsettle the council. Ceres requested an emergency alignment session. She did not enter Cale's chamber with hesitation. She entered with urgency that reflected the growing instability within the ranks. The eastern units are no longer reliable, she said immediately. We need a structured purge of the affected zone. If this is contamination, it will spread into central territory. Cale stood near the territorial stone. He did not turn immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no emotional elevation, only evaluation. It is not contamination. Ceres paused. Then what is it? A silence followed that was longer than protocol allowed in council discourse. When Cale answered, he did not look at her. It is continuity without confirmation. That statement created a stillness in the room that even Ceres did not immediately challenge. Because it did not fit any known classification of threat. And Cale knew that. That was why he said it. Across the same period, the third major incident occurred deeper within the eastern zone. A reconnaissance unit of 5 wolves was deployed under sealed observation protocol. Their objective was simple. Confirm whether Elora Vale had re-entered observable territory or whether all reports were the result of residual perception distortion. The unit did not return intact. 3 members returned physically unharmed. 1 returned unable to recall the mission entirely. The 5th was not found. The survivors were separated for independent debriefing. Their accounts did not match. Not in minor details, but in structure. One described a figure standing near the tree line that seemed aware of them before they saw it. Another described only the feeling of being observed without confirmation of presence. The third refused to describe anything at all beyond a single repeated statement. We were not there first. When pressed for clarification, he became unresponsive. The report was escalated directly to Cale. And for the first time since Elora's departure, he did not dismiss inconsistencies as human limitation. He ordered containment of all Eastern narrative reports, not because they were unreliable, but because they were converging. And convergence meant pattern formation, which meant adaptation. That evening, Cale reviewed all available data alone. No council presence, no Ceres input, only fragmented reports, patrol inconsistencies, and territorial maps that no longer aligned perfectly with themselves when overlaid across time intervals. And within that silence of analysis, Cale noticed something that had not been present before. The reports were not simply describing Elora's absence. They were describing a shift in how absence behaved. Not disappearance. Redefinition. As if the concept of missing no longer applied to her existence in a stable way. And then came the fourth incident. Not within the forest, but within Silver Ridge itself. A junior patrol guard stationed near the inner stone boundary reported a presence at dawn. No intrusion alarm was triggered. No perimeter breach was recorded. But the guard insisted that someone had stood within the boundary line during early light cycle transition. When questioned, he described Elora Vale, not as seen directly, but as recognized without sight. He said, "I didn't see her arrive. I just realized she was already there in the way the air felt wrong." When the inspection unit arrived at the location, no physical trace was found. No scent. No disturbance. No tracks. Only a single anomaly in the soil structure that suggested pressure had been applied without directional force. And beneath it a marking. Not carved. Not scratched. Pressed. As if something had been impressed into the ground by presence alone. When the marking was replicated in documentation, every copy failed to stabilize visually. Each observer described it differently. Some saw a symbol. Some saw erosion. Some saw nothing at all. And that discrepancy was the first time Cale understood something fundamental had changed. The issue was no longer Elora's location. It was interpretability. That night, Cale left the central structure again. But this time he did not go alone in intent. He went with awareness that something was now observing structure from outside its definition. The eastern forest did not resist him. But it no longer acknowledged him either. There was no reaction to alpha presence. No shift in terrain behavior. No environmental adjustment. It was not hostility. It was indifference elevated to function. As Cale moved deeper, he noticed something that had not occurred before. His presence did not create expectation. Created delay. As if the forest required additional processing time to register him at all. Then he stopped, because something had changed in the space ahead. Not visually. Not audibly. Structurally. The forest was no longer consistent in depth perception. Distance did not behave correctly. And within that misalignment, Cale felt it again. Not sound. Not movement. Recognition. And then Elora spoke. Not from a fixed position, but from alignment within the environment itself. "You are late to understanding what you already allowed to begin." Cale turned slowly. And there she was. Not approaching. Not appearing. Simply present in a way that no longer required transition. Elora Vale stood between fractured light and shadow that did not fully agree on their boundaries. Cale did not speak immediately. Because the first thing he noticed was not her presence. It was the absence of confirmation required to validate it. Finally he spoke. "What are you doing to the pack?" Elora's expression did not change. "I am not doing anything to it." Then she continued. "It is doing what it always did. I am just no longer correcting its interpretation of me." Cale stepped forward. The forest adjusted slightly. Not to him. Around him. Elora did not move. And Cale realized something that had not been present in any report until this moment. She was not being followed. She was not even being located. She was being acknowledged only when observation collapsed into certainty. And certainty was no longer stable around her. Cale spoke again, quieter. "You are destabilizing structure." Elora tilted her head slightly. "No." Then correction. "I am removing myself from its need to define me." Silence followed. And in that silence, Cale understood the full implication. The pack was no longer losing Elora. It was losing the ability to agree on what she was in the first place. Elora turned slightly, not fully away. As if preparing to end something that no longer required continuation. Cale's voice lowered. "If you are not part of the structure, what are you?" Elora looked at him for a long moment. And when she answered, there was no declaration. Only finality. "I am what remains when structure stops being required to explain survival." Then she stepped back. And the forest did not hide her. It reorganized around her absence from definition. And for the first time, Cale did not follow. Not because he chose not to, but because something within him finally understood that following no longer guaranteed arrival. And Chapter 4 ended not with departure, but with the realization that Elora Vale was no longer a missing Luna. She was a variable the entire system could no longer compute. It belongs to structure itself. Because by this point, Silver Ridge was no longer reacting to Elora Vale. It was adapting around her. And adaptation, inside an alpha-controlled system, is never neutral. It is a sign that control is no longer absolute. Across the Eastern Territories, the first measurable change was not in sightings, but in mapping failure. Entire sections of terrain began producing inconsistent readings depending on who documented them. Scouts sent with identical routes returned with completely different spatial interpretations. Distances no longer aligned with previously verified measurements. A path that required hours to cross on one report could be described as minutes on another, without any physical contradiction to explain the difference. At first, Cale's council attempted to correct this through reinforcement patrols, then through synchronized observation units, then through elimination of redundant reporting variables. None of it stabilized the data, because the issue was no longer data collection. It was data agreement, and that meant the forest was no longer being observed in a consistent state. It was being interpreted differently depending on proximity to something that could not be confirmed. Elora Vale was no longer just missing from the pack. She was present in the inconsistencies. Cale recognized this before anyone else would allow themselves to say it aloud. But recognition did not immediately translate into explanation. And that gap between understanding and language became the most dangerous space in Silver Ridge. That night, Cale ordered a controlled eastern descent operation. Not a pursuit. Not a retrieval. Confirmation. A structured attempt to isolate whether Elora Vale existed as an entity, or whether the phenomenon attributed to her was a collective distortion emerging from environmental instability. The unit consisted of 9 wolves, selected for cognitive resilience and low suggestibility response. Their objective was simple: maintain constant communication, confirm physical reality of targets, and return with uninterrupted sensory continuity. They did not return as a complete unit. 6 returned within expected parameters. 2 returned with missing memory segments between entry and midpoint of operation. 1 did not return at all. The 6 survivors were debriefed separately. And for the first time, their accounts did not differ in minor interpretation. They differed in foundational perception. 1 described Elora Vale as standing at the edge of a clearing, watching them without movement. Another described only a sensation of being observed without visual confirmation. A third insisted the forest itself had shifted to prevent them from agreeing on her location. But it was the 4th report that changed Cale's interpretation entirely. He said, "We were not trying to find her. We were trying to confirm whether we were still the ones doing the searching." That statement was not treated as psychological collapse. It was treated as operational failure, because it implied recursion in perception. And recursion inside a structured pack environment meant feedback instability. Cale dismissed the unit from active duty and sealed the Eastern Descent logs. But he did not stop reading them. Because within the inconsistencies, a pattern was beginning to form. Elora was not acting upon the pack. The pack was acting differently in her absence of definition. And that distinction carried implications that Cale had not yet fully accepted. That same cycle, a second development occurred inside Silver Ridge itself. A guard stationed at the central boundary line reported a presence during shift transition. No intrusion alarms were triggered. No perimeter breach was logged. But the guard insisted that someone had crossed the internal boundary without resistance from the system. When asked to describe the individual, he stated only one name, Elora Vale, but not with certainty of sight. With certainty of recognition. As if identity was not being observed, but recalled. When a response unit arrived at the location, no physical presence was confirmed. No environmental disturbance was recorded. Yet the soil structure showed subtle compression patterns that suggested weight had been applied in a way not consistent with physical entry. And beneath it, another marking was found. Not carved, not left, but impressed. As if reality itself had briefly registered contact and then released it. The marking could not be replicated consistently in documentation. Each observer described a different structure. Some saw a symbol. Some saw erosion patterns. Some saw nothing at all. And this inconsistency was no longer treated as coincidence. It was becoming recognized as exposure variance. Meaning perception itself was unstable around the subject. Cale reviewed the reports alone. Not as alpha issuing judgment, but as observer attempting to maintain coherence. And for the first time he stopped analyzing Elora Vale as an individual moving through territory. He began analyzing her as a condition affecting systems that tried to define her. That realization changed his next decision. He left Silver Ridge without council authorization. Not to pursue. Not to retrieve. But to verify. The Eastern Forest did not respond to his entry in the way it once had. There was no acknowledgement of alpha presence. No environmental adjustment. No structured reaction from wildlife or terrain. It was not resistance. It was absence of recognition. As if Cale Draven had become a variable the forest no longer needed to account for. As he moved deeper he noticed something new. The forest no longer maintained consistent spatial logic around him. Paths did not branch predictably. Distance did not remain stable. Even sound behaved inconsistently, arriving late or not at all. It was not disorientation. It was selective coherence failure. And at the center of it, Cale felt something he had not experienced since his rise to power. He was no longer certain the environment was reacting to him. Then it happened, not as arrival, not as movement, but as alignment. Elora Vale was there, standing where perception resolved into clarity, not approaching, not hiding, simply existing in a way that no longer required confirmation. Cale did not speak immediately, because the first realization that struck him was not her presence. It was that nothing around her was attempting to define her anymore. And without definition, even alpha perception lost structure. Finally he spoke. "What have you become?" Elora did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried no instability, only continuity. "I stopped becoming what was required to remain understandable." Cale stepped forward. The forest did not react to him. But it did not reject him either. It simply no longer prioritized him in its interpretation. Elora's gaze remained steady. And for the first time Cale understood the second layer of the problem. She was no longer being followed. No longer being tracked. No longer even being located in the traditional sense. She was being interpreted differently depending on who attempted to observe her. And interpretation was no longer stable. Cale spoke again. "You are changing how the pack perceives reality." Elora's response was immediate. "No." Then correction. "I am removing myself from their need to stabilize it around me." Silence followed. Not absence. Compression. The kind of silence that feels like meaning is being withheld, not removed. Cale's voice lowered. "If you are not part of the structure, what remains of you?" Elora's expression did not shift. Only her answer did. "What remains is what never required permission to exist." Then she turned slightly. Not to leave, but to conclude. And the forest responded. Not by hiding her, but by reorganizing itself around her absence from definition. Cale did not move. Not because he was unable, but because something inside the structure of his understanding had stopped producing reliable direction. And as Elora Vale stepped deeper into the Eastern Forest, Chapter 5 ended not with pursuit or disappearance, but with the collapse of certainty that she could ever be reduced to something the pack could name again. Because by now, Elora Vale was not being reported. She was being felt through systems that were not designed to interpret feeling. and that made her impossible to contain in any traditional sense of pack control. What began in the eastern forest had started to echo inward, not as invasion, but as distortion in consistency. Reports that once aligned across multiple units no longer matched even when gathered at the same time, from the same location. Patrol logs contradicted each other without evidence of error. Even the council archive, once considered absolute, began producing minor discrepancies in recorded timestamps and sequence alignment. At first, Cale Draven ordered recalibration of all internal reporting systems, then redundancy validation, then witness isolation protocols. None of it corrected the drift, because the drift was not mechanical. It was interpretive. An interpretation, once unstable, spreads faster than structure can correct it. That was when Cale stopped treating Elora Vale as an external variable, and began treating her as an internal shift in how reality was being processed inside his territory. The eastern forest remained the focal point of all anomalies, but something else had begun to emerge alongside it. A pattern of indirect influence extending beyond proximity. Wolves stationed in central zones began reporting identical sensations without contact. The feeling of being observed during decision-making moments, even when alone. Not fear. Not paranoia. Something more precise. The awareness that their certainty was no longer absolute. One guard described it as thinking something and realizing the thought was already incomplete before I finished it. He was removed from duty shortly after. Not for false reporting, but for instability in cognitive assurance. Cale reviewed these accounts without interruption, and for the first time he stopped searching for Elora's location, because location implied containment, and containment no longer applied. That night, Cale returned to the eastern perimeter alone again, not as Alpha issuing inspection, but as observer attempting to verify whether his own perception remained reliable. The forest did not resist him, but it also did not acknowledge him in any meaningful way. It allowed passage without recognition, as if he had become irrelevant to its internal structure. That realization carried more weight than hostility ever could. Deeper within the forest, the environmental irregularities intensified. Spatial consistency weakened further. Distances lost stability. Directional certainty began to behave like suggestion rather than fact. Even Cale's trained instincts, which had once defined territorial control through precision alone, began to require correction in real time. He stopped at a point where the terrain no longer aligned with prior memory. And for the first time, Cale did not trust the map in his mind over the space in front of him. Then he heard it. Not a call. Not a warning. A recognition. Not spoken from a fixed direction, but distributed through the environment itself. Elora Vale was present, but not arriving. Not appearing. Existing within the structure of perception itself in a way that no longer required physical confirmation. Cale did not speak immediately, because what stood before him was no longer consistent with the model he had built of her. Elora was standing between two layers of fractured light beneath the canopy. Not guarded, not withdrawn, but no longer anchored to any expectation of interpretation. Cale finally spoke. You are spreading through the territory. Elora's gaze remained steady. I am not spreading. Then she continued. The territory is learning what it means when I am not defined by it. Cale stepped forward. The forest did not react to him. Not in resistance. Not in acceptance. Neutrality. Which, in his experience, was more concerning than opposition. He stopped a short distance from her, and asked the question that had been forming since the first inconsistencies began. What are you doing to my pack? Elora did not respond immediately. When she did, there was no emotional shift. Only clarity. I am not doing anything to your pack. Then correction. I stopped being something your pack can stabilize itself around. Silence followed. And in that silence, Cale understood something that did not fit within his previous framework of control. The pack was no longer being destabilized by action. It was being destabilized by the removal of a reference point it had unconsciously relied on for coherence. Elora was not attacking structure. She was no longer participating in it. And absence, in a system built on defined roles, was not neutral. It was disruptive. Kale's voice lowered. Then what remains of your role here? Elora looked at him for a long moment. Not measuring him. Not evaluating. Confirming something internal. Then she answered. What remains is what was never assigned. Then she added. And what you never noticed was already independent of your approval. That statement landed without resistance. Because it was not an accusation. It was a classification. Kale took another step forward. The forest shifted slightly. Not toward him. Around the conversation. As if it was adjusting for significance rather than authority. Elora did not retreat. But something changed in how she was perceived at that distance. Not form. Not presence. Accessibility. Kale spoke again, slower now. You were my Luna. Elora's response came immediately. No. Then correction. I was what you called Luna because you needed the system to remain stable. Silence followed. And in that silence, Kale finally acknowledged what the reports had been failing to describe. Elora was no longer a position within the pack structure. She was the point at which structure stopped behaving predictably. Kale's voice tightened slightly. You cannot exist outside the structure that created your role. Elora's expression did not change. I am not outside it. Then the final clarification. I am what it becomes when I stop holding it together. For the first time since unifying 7 territories, Kale did not respond immediately. Because there was no counterstructure available in language that could resolve that statement. The forest around them remained still. But not empty. Attentive. And for the first time, Kale realized the environment was no longer responding to hierarchy. It was responding to coherence. Elora turned slightly, not fully breaking engagement, but signaling conclusion. And Kale noticed it immediately. Not departure. Transition. As if the interaction itself had reached its designed endpoint without his approval. He spoke once more. Is this what you intended? Elora paused. Then answered without turning fully away. No. A brief silence. This is what happens when you stop being the only thing holding someone in place. And with that she stepped back. Not vanishing. Not disappearing. Simply no longer maintaining alignment with observation. And the forest followed her in the only way it now could. Not through movement, but through redefinition. Kale remained standing in the eastern forest as Chapter 6 closed, not with confrontation or loss, but with the realization that Elora Vale was no longer a presence within his territory. She had become the reason his territory could no longer describe itself the same way twice. Not rebellion, not invasion, not collapse, but loss of interpretive authority. Because by now, Elora Vale was no longer a matter of location, pursuit, or containment. She had become a condition the pack could no longer describe consistently across shared experience. And in a structured system built on absolute hierarchy, that was not just instability. It was erosion of meaning. Across the territory, the symptoms were no longer confined to the eastern forest. They had expanded inward. Guard rotations began failing synchronization not due to error, but due to disagreement in recollection. 2 units assigned to the same perimeter shift would later describe fundamentally different environmental behavior, both insisting their version was correct. Archive records, once considered absolute, began showing subtle inconsistencies in sequence alignment when cross-verified across departments. At first, the Council attempted to correct it through stricter reporting chains, then through witness isolation, then through elimination of cross-reference contamination. But none of it resolved the core issue, because the instability was not in recording. It was in agreement, and Kale Draven understood finally that Elora was no longer acting within the pack. She was acting as a disruption to how the pack stabilized reality. That realization did not arrive with emotion. It arrived with structure collapse at the conceptual level. Because everything Kale had built relied on one assumption: that perception would remain consistent under authority. And Elora was proving that assumption no longer held. That night, Kale left Silver Ridge alone. Not as Alpha issuing oversight. Not as Commander enforcing control. But as something closer to witness. Because there were now only two possibilities left. Either Elora Vale was an anomaly that could be corrected, or she had become something that redefined what correction meant. The Eastern Forest no longer reacted to him in any measurable way. There was no recognition of hierarchy, no environmental adjustment, no instinctive acknowledgement of dominance. Simply allowed him to pass, as if authority had become irrelevant to its internal logic. That was the first time Kale understood something fundamental had shifted beyond territorial control. He was no longer entering a domain. He was entering a system that did not recognize him as a reference point. And that meant Elora was no longer contained within geography. She was distributed across perception. Deeper inside the forest, Kale stopped again at a boundary that did not exist in physical form. There was no marking, no terrain shift, no visible threshold, only a change in coherence. Sound no longer behaved consistently. Distance became unreliable. Even time felt less linear, as if the forest was no longer maintaining synchronized interpretation with his internal rhythm. Then he felt it. Not presence approaching. Not movement. Recognition occurring. Elora Vale was already there. Not arriving. Not emerging. Already integrated into the space in a way that did not require transition. Kale did not speak immediately, because what stood before him no longer aligned with any previous definition of her. Elora stood beneath fractured canopy light that did not settle correctly around her outline. Not defensive, not distant, but no longer structured by expectation. Kale finally spoke. "You are no longer in any report." Elora's gaze remained steady. "I was never in them in the way you assumed." Was. Then she continued. "They only recorded what they were able to agree on." Kale stepped forward slightly. The forest did not react. Not even subtly. Which confirmed what he was already beginning to understand. Authority no longer influenced environmental response. Elora spoke before he could continue. "You came to correct what you cannot define." Kale did not deny it. Because denial required stability in classification. And classification was what was failing. He said instead, "If you are not part of the pack structure, what are you?" Elora did not answer immediately. When she did, it was not explanation. It was clarification of state. "I am what remains when a system stops being able to use me as a reference to stay consistent." Silence followed. Not empty silence. Final silence. The kind that occurs when language stops improving understanding. Kale's voice lowered. "You are affecting every layer of order I built." Elora's expression did not change. "No." Was. Then correction. "I am not affecting it. I am revealing where it depended on me without acknowledging it." That statement carried weight not because it was emotional, but because it was structural. Kale realized in that moment that Elora had never been a stabilizing presence in the way the council described. She had been an unacknowledged reference point that the system had unknowingly used to maintain internal coherence. And now that reference point was no longer available, which meant the system was not breaking. It was revealing its dependency. Kale took another step forward. And for the first time, Elora stepped back slightly. Not in retreat, but in conclusion of proximity. Because the interaction itself was reaching its limit. Kale spoke again. "Is this what you intended?" Elora paused, then answered without hesitation. "No." A silence followed. Then she added, "But it is what happens when something is finally allowed to stop being used to hold everything else in place." Kale understood then that this was not an attack. Not rebellion. Not transformation in the way war narratives would describe it. It was release. And release, in a system built on control, is indistinguishable from collapse. Ella turned slightly, not fully departing, but signaling the end of alignment. Kale's voice followed one last time. If you leave completely, what remains of the pack? Ella looked at him for a long moment, then answered, what remains is what it becomes without assuming I will correct it. And with that, she stepped back into the forest, not disappearing, not vanishing, simply no longer aligning with any stable interpretation of presence. And this time, the forest did not hide her. It reorganized around the absence of definition she no longer needed. Kale remained standing alone. And for the first time since his rise to power, Chapter 7 did not end with control asserted or lost. It ended with something far more irreversible. The realization that Ella Vale was never the subject of the system. She was the reason the system had remained coherent long enough to believe it was in control at all. Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of agreement. Because by now, Silver Ridge was no longer reacting to Ella Vale as an individual, a rogue presence, or even a structural anomaly. It was reacting to the inability to define her in a way that remained consistent across witnesses, records, and memory itself. And that inability had spread further than the eastern forest. It had reached the core of Kale Draven's authority. Inside the central hall, the council no longer spoke in unified terms. Reports that once aligned across ranks now fractured depending on who repeated them. Even the archives, once treated as absolute truth, required cross-verification against multiple contradictory versions of the same event. Nothing remained stable long enough to become final, and Kale did not correct it. Not anymore, because correction required a stable reference point. And Ella Vale had removed that point without ever issuing a command. That realization did not come as collapse. Came as understanding. The kind that arrives too late to restore what it reveals. That night, Kale entered the eastern forest alone. Not as alpha. Not as ruler. Not as commander of territory. But as something stripped of the assumption that presence guarantees influence. The forest did not acknowledge him in any meaningful way. No shift in wind. No instinctive reaction from wildlife. No environmental adjustment to hierarchy. Simply allowed him to pass. As if authority had already been archived and filed under something no longer relevant. Deeper within the forest, Kale stopped at a location that no longer behaved like a fixed point. There was no boundary, no clearing, no defined space that could be confirmed across perception. Only coherence forming and dissolving depending on attention. Then she appeared. Ella Vale. Not arriving. Not emerging. Not stepping forward from concealment. Simply present in the way a conclusion becomes visible only when everything else has been examined enough times to stop contradicting it. Kale did not speak immediately. Because what stood before him was no longer aligned with the version of Ella that had existed within his authority structure. And he understood finally that it never had been. Ella was not changed. She was no longer being interpreted through a system that required her to remain consistent. Kale finally spoke. Everything in the pack is failing to agree on you. Ella did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice carried no elevation. Only final clarity. They are not failing to agree on me. Then she continued. They are discovering they never agreed on reality without needing me to stabilize their differences. Silence followed. Not emotional silence. Structural silence. The kind that forms when language stops producing usable distinction. Kale stepped forward. The forest did not respond. Not even in minimal acknowledgement. And that absence confirmed what he no longer needed to be told. He was no longer a reference point. Ella watched him without movement. Not as judgment. Not as opposition. But as completion of an interaction that had already reached its endpoint long before this moment. Kale spoke again, slower now. You were never just my Luna. Ella's gaze remained steady. No. Then correction. I was never yours in the way your system required me to be. Kale's voice lowered. Then what were you? Ella did not answer immediately. Because the question itself still belonged to the framework that was no longer operational. When she finally spoke, it was not identity. It was function revealed through absence of dependency. I was what your structure used to remain consistent without acknowledging its reliance on me. Silence followed. And in that silence, Cale understood the final truth. Elora Vale had never destabilized Silver Ridge through action. She had destabilized it through removal of an unspoken assumption, that coherence could exist without recognizing what it depended on. Cale's voice softened, not from defeat, but from recognition. If you are no longer part of the pack, what happens to it now? Elora looked at him for a long moment, not measuring, not evaluating, concluding. Then she answered. It becomes what it always was underneath the need to believe it was complete. Then she added. And it will adjust. The way all systems do when they stop mistaking stability for truth. Cale did not move. Because there was no remaining action that could restore what had already shifted beyond correction. Elora turned slightly. Not toward departure in the traditional sense, but toward final disassociation from observation. And as she did, the forest did not hide her. It aligned around her absence of necessity. Cale remained standing alone beneath a canopy that no longer responded to hierarchy, command, or recognition of authority. And in that final moment, the truth of everything that had occurred settled without resistance. Elora Vale had not become his greatest fear because she opposed him. She had become it because she proved something no alpha rule had ever accounted for. That control does not fail through resistance. It fails when the system realizes it was never the only thing holding reality together. And as Elora walked deeper into the eastern forest beyond classification, beyond tracking, beyond definition itself, Silver Ridge did not fall. It simply began to become something it had never been allowed to notice. And Cale Draven, the alpha who once unified 7 territories through absolute certainty, was left with the only conclusion that could no longer be corrected. She did not destroy his world. She revealed that it had always depended on her silence to remain stable. And now, she was no longer silent. And that was the moment everything changed forever.